She wasn't supposed to be there. Wrong name on the guest list, wrong seat at the table, wrong man sitting beside her. A man whose last name made rooms go quiet and whose eyes never missed a thing. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't have to. And for 3 hours, while crystal clinked and conversation flowed around them like nothing in the world was wrong, his hand rested against her knee under that table, still, warm, and completely deliberate. She didn't move away. That was the moment everything changed, even if neither of them would admit it yet. This is a story about a woman who built her whole life around never needing anyone, and the one man who made that feel like the loneliest thing she'd ever done. If you're new here, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love knowing you're out there. Now let's get into the story. Chicago had a way of making people feel small. Not cruelly, but honestly. The way only a city built on ambition and cold wind could. The skyline pressed against the late October sky like something permanent and indifferent, and Juliet Chadwick moved through it the way she moved through most things. Quickly, with purpose, and with a very specific kind of loneliness that she had long since decided didn't count as loneliness at all. She was 27 years old. She had a byline that people respected, and she had not cried at a movie in 4 years. She was fine. She was always fine. The invitation had arrived on a Tuesday, forwarded to her inbox by a distracted editorial assistant who had mixed up 2 names on a press list, hers and Margaret Hale's, the senior culture correspondent who was somewhere in Portugal, eating pastéis de nata and not answering emails. The subject line read, "Private Cultural Dinner, Jennings Foundation, Thursday, 7 p.m., formal." Juliet had skimmed it the way she skimmed everything, noted the address in Lincoln Park, added it to her calendar, and moved on. She had covered enough of these polished, self-congratulatory evenings to know the formula by heart. Expensive wine, mediocre canapes, someone's third wife wearing something architectural, and a 40-minute speech about the importance of arts funding. She brought her best black dress and her lowest expectations. The townhouse on Burling Street did not look like a foundation. It looked like a place where decisions were made that never appeared in any public record. 4 stories of dark limestone behind a wrought iron gate, lit from within by something warm and deliberate. 2 men in suits stood at the entrance without smiling. Juliet smiled for both of them, gave her name with the particular confidence of someone who belongs everywhere until proven otherwise, and walked inside. The interior was all dark wood and amber light, low music she couldn't quite identify, and a dining room where 12 people were already seated around a table long enough to suggest that whoever owned this house thought in terms of legacy, not square footage. She found her place card near the head of the table and sat down, smoothing her dress with one hand and reaching for the water glass with the other, scanning the room with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has spent years reading spaces for a living. That was when she saw him. He was already seated. He wasn't looking at her, or at least that was what she told herself in the 3 seconds before she understood that he had been watching her since she walked through the door. Bodie Jennings was not what the name suggested. She had half expected someone older, thicker, with the particular smugness of inherited wealth. What she found instead was a man of 33 who wore stillness like other men wore confidence. Not performed, not practiced, simply native to him. The way some people are just naturally warm, and others are just naturally dangerous. Dark hair, a jaw that looked like it had been decided upon very carefully. Eyes that were some complicated shade between brown and black, and were currently doing something that Juliet's professional brain categorized as assessing, and her less professional brain categorized as something she was not going to examine right now. He said nothing. He nodded once, minimal, unhurried, and returned his attention to the room. Juliet picked up the menu card in front of her and pretended to read it. Her pulse was doing something unreasonable, and she was already composing the sentence in her head that she would use to describe this moment to her friend Dana tomorrow. Something dry and perfectly calibrated to make it sound like nothing. She just hadn't found the right words yet. The dinner began the way those evenings always did, with the careful choreography of people who knew each other well enough to be polite and not well enough to be honest. Wine was poured. Introductions were made across the table in that clipped, efficient way of people who already knew who mattered and who didn't. Juliet played her part without effort, asking the right questions, laughing at the right moments, keeping her recorder off and her instincts very much on. She was good at this. She had built an entire career on being the most observant person in any room, while appearing to simply be enjoying herself. What she was less good at was ignoring the man sitting 18 inches to her left. Bodie Jennings spoke rarely, and only when addressed directly, and when he did, his voice was low enough that the table leaned in slightly without realizing it. He had that quality, the kind that couldn't be learned, where his silence carried more weight than most people's speeches. Juliet caught herself cataloging him the way she cataloged everything. The way he held his wine glass by the stem without thinking about it. The way his shoulders stayed completely still, even when the conversation around him grew animated. The way his eyes moved through the room at intervals that felt less like curiosity and more like maintenance. He was watching everything, including, with a frequency she was trying very hard not to track, her. The first time their eyes met properly, it lasted maybe 2 seconds. Long enough for Juliet to understand that whatever assessing he had been doing when she walked in, he hadn't stopped. She looked away first. She told herself it was strategy. It wasn't. The hand came without announcement, somewhere between the second course and the third. She had been listening to the woman across from her describe a gallery opening in River North when she felt it. Warm, unhurried, resting against the side of her knee, with the kind of certainty that didn't ask permission because it had never needed to. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. She kept her eyes forward and her expression completely neutral, which was either her greatest professional achievement or proof that she had genuinely lost her mind. She wasn't sure which. Bodie said nothing. He was responding to something his associate on the left had said, his voice measured and unbothered, as if one part of him was fully present at that dinner table, while another part existed in a different conversation entirely, one that had no words and apparently no intention of explaining itself. Juliet reached for her wine glass. Her hand was steady. Her heartbeat was not. Internally, she was doing something she almost never did. She was at a complete loss. The irony she usually kept loaded and ready had gone quiet, which was, in its own way, more unsettling than the hand itself. She wanted to say something sharp and deflating. She wanted to shift her chair 2 inches to the left and reclaim the version of herself who did not sit still while strangers touched her knee at dinner parties. Instead, she sat there, pulse running warm, and thought about how she was going to write about this. Because turning experience into narrative was how she processed the world, how she kept safe distance from things that threatened to get too close. But even as she reached for that habit, she knew something was different. She wasn't thinking about the story. She was thinking about him. And Bodie, who had not looked at her once since his hand found its place, allowed himself one thought he would not have admitted to anyone in that room: that she was the first person in longer than he could remember who had made him want to explain himself. The dinner ended the way storms end, not with drama, but with a strange, disorienting stillness that made everything feel slightly rearranged. guests gathered coats and exchanged numbers with the practiced ease of people accustomed to leaving rooms gracefully. And Juliet moved through it all, with her chin up and her thoughts running at a frequency she couldn't quite slow down. Bodhi's hand had left her knee when dessert arrived, as quietly as it had come, and he had spent the final 40 minutes of the evening in conversation with a silver-haired man at the far end of the table, without looking in her direction once. Which was fine, completely fine. She was already mentally drafting the text to Dana, something like, "You will not believe the evening I just had," when she reached the foyer and found her coat was not where she'd left it. One of the staff appeared with it almost immediately, and behind him, unhurried, hands in his pockets, was Bodhi. "You came alone," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't quite a statement either. It occupied that particular space that some men never learned to find, the one that gave a woman room to answer or not, without pressure, without performance. Juliet took her coat from the staff member and turned to face him fully for the first time all evening. Up close, he was even harder to look at casually. There was a small scar along his left jaw she hadn't noticed from across the table, pale and thin, and she had the involuntary thought that she wanted to know the story behind it before she wanted to know almost anything else about him. "I did," she said, keeping her voice exactly as light as she intended. "You?" He almost smiled. It didn't fully arrive, but it disturbed something in the corner of his mouth that changed his face considerably. "Always," he said. She walked out into the October air and told herself she was relieved. The next 3 days were normal. She filed a piece on a ceramic artist in Pilsen, attended a staff meeting that ran 40 minutes over, and had dinner with Dana on Friday night at their usual place in Wicker Park, a narrow Italian restaurant where the tables were too close together and the wine was always slightly too cold. Dana was warm and funny and asked the right questions, and Juliet told her about the dinner with enough detail to be honest and enough omission to keep something for herself, which was unusual because Juliet generally processed everything out loud. "He touched your knee for 3 hours and then said 12 words to you, and you're already..." Dana pointed at her with a fork. "You're already somewhere else. Right now. You're at that table." Juliet opened her mouth to deny it and found, with some annoyance, that she couldn't. "I don't know anything about him," she said instead, which was true and not quite the point. What she didn't say, what she turned over quietly while Dana moved on to other topics, was that she had, purely out of professional habit, done a search on the Jennings name the morning after the dinner. What she found made her set her coffee down slowly and sit very still for a moment. The Jennings family was not a foundation. It was not a cultural initiative. It was a name that appeared in federal court documents, in investigative pieces published by journalists far braver than she was, in a pattern of influence that stretched across 3 states and several decades. She closed the browser tab. Then she opened it again. And that was where the trouble actually began. Not at the dinner table, not in the foyer, but in the quiet of her apartment on a Friday morning, when her journalist's instincts, and something newer and more inconvenient, pulled in exactly opposite directions, and she sat between them, unable to choose. She didn't write the story. That was the first thing, the decision that arrived quietly on a Saturday morning while she was still in her pajamas and felt less like a choice and more like an acknowledgement of something she'd already known. She had the notes. She had the browser tabs, the court document references, the name of a federal attorney who had been quoted in a 2018 piece about the Jennings family's reach across the Midwest. She had enough to bring to her editor as a preliminary pitch, the kind of thing that could become something real with 3 weeks of focused reporting. She closed the laptop. She told herself it was ethics, that she had been in that room under false pretenses, that anything she wrote would be compromised by how she'd gotten there. It was a reasonable argument. It was also only partially true, and she was too honest with herself to pretend otherwise. The real reason lived closer to the surface than she wanted to admit. She was still thinking about him. It had been 6 days since the dinner, and Bodie Jennings had taken up residence in some quiet corner of her mind, with the same calm certainty with which his hand had found her knee, without announcement, without apology, as if he simply belonged there and was prepared to wait. She didn't have his number. She didn't have any point of contact. She had a name, a face, a scar she couldn't stop thinking about, and the memory of a voice that said, always, like it meant something larger than the question she'd asked. It should have been enough to let it go. It wasn't. The call came on a Tuesday evening while she was walking back from the train station on Milwaukee Avenue, coat pulled tight against a wind that had turned genuinely bitter overnight. An unknown number. She almost didn't answer. "I hope this isn't a bad time," Bodie said, and the particular quality of his voice on the phone, lower, more immediate, did something to her equilibrium that she immediately resented. "It depends on who's asking," she said, which was not the smooth, unbothered response she'd intended, but was at least honest. "You already know who's asking." She stopped walking. A couple moved around her on the sidewalk without looking up, and she stood very still in the middle of the foot traffic, with her pulse doing that unreasonable thing again. "How did you get this number?" "I looked for it." The simplicity of that answer was somehow more disarming than any elaborate explanation would have been. He hadn't pretended it was coincidence. He hadn't constructed a story. He had just looked for it because he wanted it, and apparently that was the kind of man he was. Juliet started walking again, slower now, buying herself time under the guise of movement. "What do you want, Bodie?" It was the first time she'd used his name. She heard the almost pause on his end, brief enough that she might have imagined it, and knew she hadn't. "Dinner," he said. "Just dinner." She looked up at the Chicago sky, the color of pewter, the first suggestion of November pressing down on the city like a held breath. She thought about the browser tabs. She thought about the court documents and the journalist braver than herself and every reasonable instinct she had spent 27 years carefully developing. "Where?" she asked. And just like that, the decision was made. Not with certainty, not without the particular fear that comes with choosing something you can't entirely explain, but with the quiet, irreversible quality of a door opening inward. The restaurant he chose was nothing like the townhouse on Burling Street. It was small, tucked into a side street in the West Loop, the kind of place with 12 tables and no sign out front, and a reservation list that apparently meant nothing if your last name was Jennings. Juliet arrived 3 minutes early, which was unusual for her. She was normally precise to the minute, a habit she'd developed as a reporter who understood that how you entered a room said something before you opened your mouth. The extra 3 minutes betrayed her, and she knew it the second she walked in and found him already there, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the forearm, looking entirely at ease in a way that suggested he had never in his life arrived anywhere and felt out of place. He stood when he saw her. That detail landed somewhere quiet and unexpected inside her chest. He pulled out her chair himself, dismissing the host with a glance, and Juliet sat down and reminded herself that she was a woman who interviewed difficult people for a living and was not remotely intimidated by a man who knew how to be still. "You look like you prepared talking points," he said, settling back into his seat with that fractional, almost smile. "I always prepare talking points," she said. "Does that bother you?" "No," he said, and the way he said it like the question had genuinely surprised him, made her believe him completely. The evening opened slowly, the way good conversations do when both people are paying real attention. He asked about her work with the kind of curiosity that didn't feel like politeness, and she found herself describing a piece she'd written the previous spring about a South Side muralist. Not the published version, but the real one. The version where she'd spent 3 Saturdays in a cold warehouse, learning what the work actually meant before she wrote a single word. He listened without interrupting. That alone was rarer than it should have been. She asked him about the foundation, using the word deliberately, watching his face. Something shifted behind his eyes, not defensively, but carefully. The way a person moves when they're deciding how much of a truth to offer. "It's complicated," he said. "Most things worth anything are." She nodded slowly, filing it away not as a journalist now, but as someone sitting across from a man she was trying to understand. The food arrived and the conversation moved, and at some point, the talking points she'd prepared dissolved entirely, replaced by something more natural and considerably more dangerous. It was when the dessert plates were cleared that he reached across the table, not under it this time, but openly, in the full light of the room, and touched the back of her hand with 2 fingers. Just that, a question asked without words. Juliet looked down at his hand, then up at his face, and for once, she didn't reach for irony or distance or the comfortable armor of wit. She turned her hand over, slowly, until her palm was against his. She felt him exhale, barely, just a slight release of tension across his shoulders that told her more about what this cost him than anything he'd said all evening. Outside, Chicago had gone dark and cold and indifferent. Inside, something warm and irreversible had quietly shifted between them. The kind of shift that doesn't announce itself, but changes the geography of everything that comes after. She didn't want the night to end. That realization arrived without warning and sat in her chest like an open window, unfamiliar, a little frightening, and completely impossible to close. The crisis arrived the way Juliet had always feared things would. Not loudly, but in print. A colleague at a competing outlet published a piece on the Jennings family on a Wednesday morning, and her editor called before she'd finished her first cup of coffee, asking why she hadn't brought him anything when she'd been at that dinner. She said she hadn't been there as a reporter. He didn't believe her, or didn't care, and the call ended with a silence that meant her credibility was now a question someone else was asking. By Thursday, Bodhi knew. She didn't find out how. He simply stopped responding, and the quality of that silence was different from his usual stillness. It had edges, and she felt every one of them. She spent 2 days waiting for an explanation that didn't come, and somewhere inside the waiting, the old version of herself began to reassemble quietly, handing her back the armor, piece by piece. She almost took it. On the 3rd day, she put on her coat and went to the townhouse on Burling Street instead. The same 2 men at the gate. She gave her name and stood in the November cold with her hands in her pockets, and her heart doing something she refused to dignify with description. They let her in. Bodhi was in a room at the back of the house she hadn't seen before. A study, shelves of books, a single lamp, the particular atmosphere of a space where someone actually spent time alone. He looked at her the way people look at things they've decided to stop wanting and haven't quite managed. "You should have told me," he said. "I know," she said. "I was going to. And then I wasn't writing it, and then I didn't know how to explain why without explaining everything else. And I'm not..." She stopped, steadied herself. "I'm not good at explaining everything else." Something moved across his face. "Neither am I," he said quietly. She crossed the room, not quickly, not with the momentum of someone who had rehearsed this, but with the deliberate calm of a woman making a decision she intended to keep. She stopped close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes and said, "I didn't write the story, Bodhi. I'm not going to. Not because I'm afraid of you, because it was never the thing I actually wanted." He was quiet for a long moment, and she understood by now that his silences were not absences. They were where he kept the things that mattered most. When he reached up and touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with a gentleness that didn't match the room, or the name, or any of the stories written about his family in federal court documents, she felt something in her chest unlock with a quiet and permanent click. "Stay," he said. One word, the same economy he used for everything important. She kissed him before she answered, and the kiss was slow and certain and tasted like the end of a very long, self-imposed exile for both of them. When she finally pulled back, she was smiling in a way she hadn't planned and couldn't have stopped. "I'm staying," she said. Outside, Chicago was cold and dark and entirely indifferent. Inside, for the first time in longer than either of them could honestly remember, neither of them was alone. And that, it turned out, was the only story that had ever really mattered. If this story moved you the way it moved us making it, drop a number from 1 to 10 in the comments. We read every single one, and your rating genuinely helps this channel grow. Thank you for spending this time with Juliet and Bodhi. We'll see you in the next one.